Okay. Can we, okay, everyone, so it's gratifying to see a line out the door, and I'll try and speak slowly, so by the time I've finished and the lecture begins, you're all inside the lecture hall. Welcome, everybody, to the inaugural Lorana Sullivan Lecture Series. I'm particularly pleased and proud to be introducing this. By the way, my name's Emily Bell. I'm the director of the Tower Centre for Digital Journalism here. But I think I've probably been selected in my role tonight because in 1990, I took my first post up at a national newspaper, The Observer in London. And Lorana Sullivan was one of, if I was the most junior reporter, she was definitely the elder, senior, and most respected statesman on the staff. I was at an event at the weekend where Jill Abramson said that she always wanted to acknowledge that she had reached the position of executive editor of the New York Times by, as she put it, standing on the shoulders of other women. And Lorana was definitely one of, if you like, for my generation of female reporters, she was one of the people's shoulders that we stood on. So it's lovely to be able to introduce this lecture tonight. For those of you who don't know, Lorana was a pioneer in the sphere of investigative financial journalism. She opened the door for women reporters at the Wall Street Journal, where she really was the first female reporter they hired. And she worked with some of the finest, such as Jonathan Whitney, Stanley Penn, and she probed the new frontier of offshore crookery, which I'm sure is a phrase she would have approved of, as well as an old Wall Street problem, organized crime. She continued leading the way when she moved to London, first with the Sunday Times and then with the Observer. Lorana was the first person to spot what became the world's biggest ever bank fraud, the Bank of Credit and Commercial International, BCCI, and I sat in probably about a year's worth of newsroom meetings where every week Lorana would come and say, there is something wrong at BCCI, they are definitely in trouble, which really was a great lesson for reporters about how you should stay on that story and look at the detail. She was all over the mafia-linked boiler room scams of the 80s and a series of investment and tax frauds, big and small. Lorana was able to achieve all of this because she had a mastery of minute detail and an insatiable appetite for financial documents. In the days when that meant obtaining and reading through hundreds of hard copy, not instantly accessible e-pages. That forensic skill enabled her to hack a way through a jungle of company names and numbers that would have defeated less determined reporters in order to find that crucial paper trail. Lorana was a great fan of the Columbia Journalism School and what it stands for. She was determined to enable others to share the opportunity she had, and by doing so, she also raised the bar for business journalism, especially when it comes to investigating those with financial power, while encouraging more women to follow in her path. Which is why the Lorana Sullivan Foundation created the full scholarship program in her name, which has so far enabled more than 20 students from around the world to benefit from the J School at a cost to date of more than $1 million. And for those of you who aren't enrolled but are thinking of doing so, then we have David Hooker from our admissions office at the back. He's the gentleman with his hand raised. Because of her love of corporate detail, Lorana would have been absolutely delighted to have this inaugural lecture on a subject very close to her heart and desk, how to break through the cult of corporate omerta. She would have been doubly pleased that, like the other pioneer of women investigative reporters, Ida Tarbell, the subject of Dean Coll's most recent exposure was big oil. Both Dean Coll and Lorana Sullivan are two of a type in their forensic and brilliant reporting. So it's a great pleasure both to honour Lorana's contribution and memory, but also to introduce my boss, Dean Steve Coll, to the podium. I've actually gone the wrong way. I could be stuck behind the screen all night.
Thank you, Emily, who has no boss, but we're glad to have you with us. And I want to also just add my thanks to the Lorana Sullivan Foundation for all of the support it offers to the journalism school. It's enormously impactful, and very happy to be launching this new lecture series. I'm going to set the bar nice and low for successor lecturers, but I hope it'll be engaging and useful to you. How many people here are students at the school? Okay, good. That's what I was hoping, because I'm going to try to do a bunch of things that aren't easy to do at the same time. I want to try to give you a sort of framework for thinking about really hard, complicated, persistent investigations of corporations, some principles about how to decide whether to turn left or right at all the different intersections you inevitably encounter along the way. And then in the heart of my time with you, before we take some questions and have a reception, I will try to go down into the field with you and walk through a few examples of the use of public records, litigation records, other kinds of records to feed narrative and revelation in the context of investigating a corporation. So I'm also going to try to make this a little bit accessible by drawing on some examples from my own very often joyful and occasionally painful experience of doing these two very fat, thick, over-egged books. One is about the bin Ladens, which is essentially a book about the bin Laden's corporation, the Saudi bin Laden group, and the brothers and sisters of Osama bin Laden who grew up inside that wealth. And then this book about ExxonMobil. Essentially, these took me 8 years together, and 700 combined interviews, I would say. But unlike a lot of books that you might break down and say, where does that come from? How do I learn from it? What can I do that is mapped inside these covers? I think the answer to that in the case of a lot of journalists I admire is very hard to get to, because there's a magic in what they do. There's a voice, there's a poetry, there's a sense of imagination, even in nonfiction work. You're fortunate. That's not true with me. I'm very Teutonic. When you tear my work down, there's a lot of wires and bolts, and it's really connected together in a way that I think is accessible and possible to explain. So my objective is to try to just explain the outline of what this method is, so that you can adapt it for yourself. Now, the other thing I just want to emphasize, let me see here. If I press escape, will I get my own slide? Yes, okay, sorry. Is that, in my own experience of journalism, working alongside a lot of really great investigators and great investigative reporters, I learned that there are just a lot of ways to be a very effective investigative reporter. What I'm going to talk about, I feel very self-conscious, is my method, and it has certain characteristics. If you were a scientist, you would kind of interrogate your own method, and in my case, I would say that it's kind of biased. It's biased toward narrative, it's biased towards complexity, and it's biased toward a kind of epic scale of diverse story threads. I think it's a little bit weak on headline revelation, though there are always little headlines inside of it, and it's not very good for single-threaded storytelling, which I frankly don't know how to do. So if you want to learn how to do that, you should take Professor Shapiro's class or someone else who's very strong on vertical narrative. Let me just explain a little bit about how it was I came to relearn after 20 or 25 years of working on lots of different hard target subjects, the methodology of a long, persistent investigation of a very closed corporate ecosystem. So I actually did not start out to write a book about ExxonMobil. Nobody sane would start out to write a book about ExxonMobil. I started out to write a book about oil and geopolitics, and I signed up with my publisher and made certain commitments, and I was thinking of writing a book like The Prize, the great Daniel Yergin epic of oil in the age of discovery, oil in the age of American power, and I thought, this is a time, I'd just come out of the bin Ladens, and I'd spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia. I thought, I really want to write about oil again. I'd like to get out and write about the same kind of narrative, but in an age of limits, in an age of climate change, in an age of the resource curse, of shrinking opportunity for big corporations. So I started out, I signed up, I made all these commitments, and then I went out and started working, and I got about 6 months, 9 months into the project, and I just realized I had no story. I was sprawling, I was all over the map, literally. I spent a long time investigating oil in Iraq and realized that maybe it was a chapter, and so I had to start over again, and I basically thought, well, I need a single corporation to bring all of these themes together so I can narrate. And so I went to the SEC records, pulled the global oil holdings of the 4 or 5 biggest oil corporations in the world, literally plotted them on a map, assigned them different colors, and started, having that thing that you do sometimes when you're spending too much time on a project, talking to myself, interrogating the map, or well, does this book want to be about ExxonMobil? Does it want to be about BP? Does it want to be about 2 corporations, 1? And eventually I decided that ExxonMobil was the right choice because it was the largest corporation headquartered in the United States. It was a black box. Nobody had written about it since Ida Tarbell, basically. It was enormously powerful, but invisible. And also it had an advantage when you looked at where they owned oil in the world. It was very spread out, and there were lots of possible kind of places to land and to go down and tell stories on the ground. So I decided to do it, and I told my editor that I had made this change of plans, and they were supportive, and then I called up ExxonMobil and said, congratulations, I've decided to write a book about you. And that began a process, shall we say. And I think they called me back after about 4 months. For them, I had no idea when I started that for them, journalists are bugs on a windshield, and they're driving down the highway. And they're beyond no comment. They barely acknowledge that journalism is relevant to their predicaments in the world. And I had no idea how disciplined they were, because my last 3 completed books have been CIA, Bin Laden's, ExxonMobil, and ExxonMobil was the only subject that ever scared me along the way. And in part because, and they were also by far the hardest to report on, because they were so tightly disciplined as a corporation, as a culture. So if they had a policy of there's a guy out there doing a book and do not talk to him, the policy ran down the sort of synapses and the structure of the company much more effectively than in the government. So I was reflecting on what I was guided by and how I kind of got up in the morning and kept going. And the first point I thought I would make at this conceptual level is that, in my experience, when you're taking on a hard closed target, whether it's North Korea or ExxonMobil, or not to equate them, but something of that character, then it's very tempting to be searching for deep throat, or for a transformational source, or for one line of inquiry that's going to make the whole thing open up. And I think my experience is that there just is no alternative to doing everything all at once, all sources all the time, all sources of entry, points of entry. I often thought of ExxonMobil as I was working on this, by far the hardest thing I've ever done, certainly the hardest thing I ever wished to do, because I thought of it as this giant, closed, dark city, on a rock mountain, like, in the Wizard of Oz, where they go to get the Wicked Witch of the West, and they're standing outside the castle, and the gate goes up and down and up and down. And inside ExxonMobil, people did come in and out, and you could run up to them and say, "I'm a reporter. You want to talk to me?" And they'd say no. But you had this sense that there was a city inside. I knew there were 80,000 employees. I knew they had a strategy. I knew they had executives. I knew they had an executive committee. I knew they had a sense of themselves as an independent sovereign in the world. So how could I get inside, sneak inside, find ways in to start to describe and to understand who they were, why they made the decisions they did, where their fault lines were? And the answer to that is, if you're outside, you're going outside in, you have to do everything. That means civil litigation, that means the SEC, that means FOIA, that means lots of diverse interviewing strategies. It means searching for a transformational inside source, but not getting obsessed with that kind of a sourcing strategy. The second principle when you take that framework, is to look for points of conflict and exploit them as a reporter. So everybody in the world gets into conflicts. Corporations get into lots of conflicts. And it's a diverse array if you think about it. You know, in ExxonMobil's case, of course, there's a lot of lawsuits, and I'll come back to litigation, which is really at the heart of a lot of my method, civil litigation in particular. But so they get into a lot of lawsuits. They're very litigious. They're also fighters. They don't like to settle, so they end up putting a lot of things on the record in the American system that, you know, a sutler corporation might not. But it also includes their battles with the government over regulation, over fines, over workplace safety rules. And it includes their battles with shareholders, because their owners don't always like what they're doing. And every one of those points of conflict opens up a reporting opportunity. And if you figure out how to move toward those points efficiently, you can save a lot of time and move quickly inside the gates of that kind of closed city. They also get into fights with their communities, which ended up being a very important part of the narrative in Africa and Indonesia and other places where I was literally looking for places where they were at war. And it turned out there were a bunch of places: Equatorial Guinea, Aceh in Indonesia, Chad, Nigeria. And on that map, I knew enough about where the world's small wars were to say, oh, if they're there, then there must be a point of entry, because they're in conflict with their community. So I'm going to be able to go out there, I'm going to get the community's point of view about them, but I also ought to look for records. So I immediately filed FOIAs at the front end of the project for specific State Department cabling from the areas where I knew there were small wars and I knew that ExxonMobil was present, because I just figured there had to be good narrative in that. If I could get the documents out of the State Department in time to write the book, or in time for my, before I pass from this earth, which is another subject, that I knew that basically anything that came in the envelope would be useful. But on a 3 or 4 year timeline, it was like throwing a message in a bottle into the ocean. So I very quickly filed them on the basis of this mapping and this instinct about points of conflict. And then nothing happened for about 18 months. And one day I came home and there was a big fat envelope with U.S. State Department stamped on the return address. And I opened it up, and it ended up being a bunch of declassified cables from Aceh, from the war in Aceh, about ExxonMobil's involvement, that ended up being absolute gold. I sat in my car and started reading them. You know, it's one of those kind of eureka weeping moments. This book might work. There might actually be a book here. And it ends up, I mean, if I reverse engineer the book after all these years of not wanting to look at it, there are 2 chapters that were basically in that envelope that I then was able to construct. One of the big challenges in any investigative project, but especially if you take on a totally outside-in project like this one, where you're really just scrapping for every breadcrumb trail, following every window or point of light that you can find, and looking for data, for insight, for characters, is if you don't have a principle of how to filter what you're going to stick with and what you're going to set aside, then you're going to get lost. And it's very, very easy to get lost, and it's the most common problem of investigative reporting. So the sort of the strength and the weakness of having a deadline and a kind of an obligation to finish on time, or at least a desire, is that you feel disciplined by the shape of the timeline and the project. And so, and you know that in the end, in my case, I'm writing something. It has to have narrative characteristics. That means it needs to have a story. The story needs to have drama. Preferably it has some dialogue that's credible. It needs characters, and it needs somehow to all hang together. So in this all sorts is all the time methodology, when I look, and we'll look together in a minute, at the litigation that ExxonMobil is in, and I just go, whoa, that is a lot of lawsuits. Which one of those could possibly be interesting to me? The answer is, I'm looking for something that can give me a story, and I'll come back to that. Or, even if it's not a narrative, what aspects of ExxonMobil's place in the world, or Apple's, or Google's, or any other corporation you want to take on, what aspect of it intersects with the public interest in my judgment? So I was interested in these developing societies and the resource curse. I knew that. I got myself interested in climate change, even though I started out thinking, boy, that's a whole nother subject. And then I thought, well, once I understood what ExxonMobil was doing with that, I had to own it. So I turned to it, not because I saw it was a great narrative or because I even really wanted to, but because I thought I cannot write a book in the public interest without owning this subject. And then similarly, environmental spills, environmental disease, there's lots to choose from, workplace safety, and I'll show you some examples that popped up unexpectedly. Have a front door strategy. So I pick up the phone and called them and said, literally, I didn't say congratulations, but I was very pleased with myself. I'm writing a book about you. I'd love to come down and meet you and talk to you, because I always believe in going in the front door simultaneously with going around the back door. And I was a little bit stunned at first that they really didn't want to have anything to do with me. But then I thought, oh yes, I've been here before. And I'll come back and talk about what I think is the most effective way to think about that strategy and not to get too burdened by it. One thing I do see is that a lot of, especially early in a journalist's career where you're dealing with really hostile subjects and complex subjects, you can get yourself tied up thinking about what do they think of me or what should I do. And I think one of the things I've learned over the years is just to take a very detached, cold, professional attitude toward the front door. You're there, essentially think of yourself as your own little state. You send your ambassador out to their ambassador, you interact, you come back, no deal. No deal again. Okay, well, we'll be back a month from now because we're in this for professional reasons. All right, the other kind of concept I wanted to deliver was just this idea that, again, to fight against the prospect of getting lost. I think, in my experience, it has been really important for me throughout this kind of work to visualize success, even when I can't quite see it. Even when it's very foggy or sketchy or partial, or I wake up one day and think what I was visualizing is not actually success at all. It needs to be set aside. But if you're not constantly in dialogue with what the end state of your work is, imagined end state of your work, then you'll never get there, because these rabbit holes can go on forever and ever and ever. So I think of these projects in 4 phases because it helps me think about the end state and to discipline my choices, run everything through those filters that I listed before. So you start out with a map, a chronology, a very quick roundup of all the names that you can possibly use to report on. That's individual names and corporations or law firms or people who are involved in these points of conflict or other areas that you are confident will yield good reporting. And then a map, a sense of what the landscape, at least at the beginning, might be. Then the second phase, which to me lasts the longest, is just blitzkrieg, all source all the time. Okay, I've got my names, I've got my chronology, and I know that I'm not going to be in this phase forever, so give myself permission to have some dead ends. Let's go look at every civil litigation case that I can find in the federal system, even if it takes me 3 weeks, and even if I come out of there thinking, there's only 1.5 cases out of the 350 whose complaints I read that I'm interested in. But that's okay, because I'm not in a panic. I'm in the discovery phase. The discovery phase is serendipitous. It has to be all sources. It has to be a zigzag. Unless you are doing something that you know in advance, I just am reporting about this one incident. If you really want to break down a closed system, I think you kind of have to do this very open-ended, very busy period. At a certain point, though, as the clock is ticking, you need to, I find I need to identify where I'm starting to break the wall down. So where is a story? Where is a narrative? Where is a chapter? If I can't start visualizing where the chapters are coming from, then I know I'm not going to make it. But usually, after a couple of years or 2.5 years, as I'm getting up to the point where I've got maybe 6 months or 9 months until I have to start writing, then I'll say, okay, time's up for the blitzkrieg. We'll come back to that for the paperback. No more random discoveries, no more random searches or chasing around source lists. Now is the time to go deep on the subjects that I know I need to write about, so that I can fill out my portraits of characters, fill in holes, complete narratives where I may have a baseline of a lawsuit or a baseline of a FOIA request, but I need now to interview around it. I need to fill it in, and so you start to report much more purposefully into an outline. And then the last phase Usually about 6 months for me is closing, and really I hire a professional fact checker, and I also litigation proof my work, which these last 2 books I was quite focused on. I had a book contract that had insurance for me in the event that I was sued, but I noted that it had a $50,000 deductible so, for each instance of a lawsuit. So, and it didn't cost ExxonMobil but a morning's net income to file 7 suits in 7 different jurisdictions if they wanted to. All right, so now I wanted to kind of try to call up some examples that I hope will illustrate a little more concretely some of these principles or ideas. And I think, over the course of your time at the school, certainly those of you who are concentrating on this kind of work, but many of you'll be up in front of great faculty and colleagues who will teach you about public records work, give you a taste of the range of records that can produce insights, revelations, narrative, and I don't mean for what I'm going to do right now to be very comprehensive, but I want to show you some examples of how to tailor the use of records to produce material that you can actually write, as opposed to just thinking about the records as a kind of library. So I think there's sort of phase 1 of records work is learning what's out there, learning a little bit about the experience of searching, the frustrations, the amount of hours you have to put in to sift wheat from chaff. Phase 2 is learning how to ping pong between records and interviews, and to have that process constantly be focused on results, on narrative, on what you can write, what you can tell. And so I'm going to try to get at that second phase a little bit. So I read clips in 2 phases. I read one big batch at the beginning when I don't know what I'm doing for mapping purposes. So I make a big list of names and I build a chronology. So I will pull out a massive amount of clips about ExxonMobil. I'll put them into folders. I don't even really care what order they're in when I read them, because I'm going to put them into order. Then I'll sit down and I'll read, and I'll just use my intuition. I'll underline any event, any name that strikes me as interesting. And when I'm done with it, takes a week, 10 days, a lot of coffee. Then when you're done, you can whip out your laptop and go back through all of the clips and type a perfect chronology, as well as a perfect list of names that is a map, a source map, a subject map. And it's crude, but when you go through that chronological exercise, you actually start to see in reporting opportunities. You see gaps that must be explained by some action or some secret committee that had a meeting or somebody must have decided. So I do that. That's pretty basic 101 clip use. Where I've come around to a second batch of clip reading more recently is I've started to force myself to go back and read a bunch of clips in phase 3 when I'm pressing my advantages, because I realized over time that I often missed what was significant in the clips because I read them at the beginning and as a map, and I didn't understand what they were actually saying. And so if I go back to them systematically late, they actually provide a whole new round of refreshing insights and reporting possibilities. Okay. Civil litigation to me is, God's gift to journalism. I could not have had the wonderful, joyous, fun career I've had if the United States did not have open civil litigation records and basically encourage everybody to sue everybody all the time. I went back and looked at, the Bin Ladens, essentially whatever is in there about the family and the corporation that was brand new, and a fair amount really comes from civil litigation at the heart of it. I would say 75% of my baseline of original work came out of civil litigation in that book. In ExxonMobil, I would say about 50% of the book comes out of civil litigation. And one thing I've learned is that it's very important then when you start to use civil litigation records, especially indexes, to search for the nuggets of gold that are out there, that you come to the records and the indexes with very purposefully specific lists of names so that you don't miss things. So one of the traps of litigation indexing is that you never really know what the caption of the case is until you get to it. And you're not 100% sure that the names of the parties you're searching are reliably spelled or are reliably named, because companies have subsidiaries. And in the case of the bin Ladens, I realized fairly early on in my initial clip reading that there were actually 7 or 8 different ways in which their family name was transliterated into English, including by members of their own family. And it was a bit of a stroke of luck that I kind of had one of those shake awake in the middle of the nights as I was going out to do the civil litigation searching, and I thought, I better make a comprehensive list of every form of spelling and run every form of spelling through every index, otherwise I'm going to leave stuff out there that I could have. So I want to show you Derek Kravitz, who did so much to help me with this, my colleague and researcher this school year, did this. But at one point, I couldn't replicate the search, even though I've got a live connection here, because it's a pay-to-play system. But I just want to very briefly narrate how this book kind of got off the ground, which was I did that clip search. I made a list of 9 different spellings of the bin Laden name. I made a map of all the places where I thought that bin Ladens had lived at one time or another, in the United States, in the UK, in Germany, and other places. And then I physically went to all of those places, and I went to the courthouse, and I went to the real estate records center, and I ran through every index I could find, every spelling of their name. And one of the first places I went was LA County Superior Court, because I knew LA a little bit, and I knew that there had been a couple of different bin Ladens out there at different times. And they have this, like all the great courthouses, this really dark old archive room with like a 1965 computer terminal. And I started typing in bin Laden. I figured, this is a bit of a fool's errand, because surely after 9/11, if there were bin Laden civil litigation out here, the LA Times would be all over it. So I was a little bit just thinking, I got to go through this exercise. And I started typing this form of the bin Laden name, all one word with an I. And I popped up this divorce from one of Osama's brothers. And then I went down into the literally underground in downtown LA and pulled the file, and it was like 8 volumes. And then I sat down over the course of 2 days and started reading, and I got to the part about where his ex-wife, Christine, hired a forensic accountant to go to Saudi Arabia to audit the bin Laden family finances, and returned a report. And I thought, nobody had, the FBI had not been there. This was like completely new ground, and I was, you know who the reporter is in these indexes. Mostly people are there for sad reasons, chasing down some record they need for some bankruptcy or a divorce. But the journalists are the one at the table going, oh my God, oh, this is fantastic. So I did that a few times. But if you ever went back and kind of reverse engineered the book, you would find incredible dialogue from Ibrahim with his lawyers about the family money and his brothers and and it was all in that archive that day. And then I went to Florida and to Texas and to various other places, and I would say, as I said, about 2/3 of the book was based on that. Now let's see if I can find the second page. Okay, this is the docket from his divorce. And if you just start reading it, it's the first thing that pops up even before you pull the file. So you're now just standing at the courthouse, you're doing your exercise of running your names through the indexes. And if you scroll down and you're just reading, because the main thing you do with a civil suit is you read the complaint, because that's where the story is. Somebody has to tell a story. This guy done me wrong. And then you can read the response, and sometimes they'll say, no, we didn't do you wrong, or sometimes they'll just say deny, 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 and it's not very useful. But it's the original complaint that tells you, okay, what is this about? You didn't pay me. And so I was reading down here, let's see if I can find it, 9402, declaration, income and expense. So I'm thinking, okay, bin Laden family declaration, income and expense, I'm interested in that. And so that's kind of where that began, sorry. Let's see if I can figure out how to shrink this again, moving right along. A couple other sort of idiosyncratic things I wanted to point out. In the same exercise with ExxonMobil, I won't show you the exercise of using PACER, but you know what PACER is. PACER is the index system, the computer system that allows you to search federal cases. Now, in my experience, federal cases are nowhere near as rewarding as narrative as county cases. So you really do need to locate the counties in the United States where corporations are doing business or where they might get into conflict. In the case of ExxonMobil, that could be many, many counties. But the kinds of slip and fall cases and the tort cases that happen at the county level are generally better for journalism than federal cases. But every now and then you'll get some good, especially corporate titan conflicts in the federal system. So in Exxon's case, I started with PACER because then I didn't even have to leave my desk. There were 55 cases captioned ExxonMobil on each page, and there were 45 pages. And I went through them, and basically a lot of them were quite interesting. They were large tort actions about chemical spills and refinery pollution. They were payment disputes involving contractors that gave you insight into how ExxonMobil organized its business. They were slip and fall cases of a worker on a platform offshore Nigeria. When you read the complaint and the depositions, you suddenly got all this free information about how ExxonMobil operated offshore in Nigeria that you could never have found any other way. But one of the ones that I wanted to focus on was an EEOC complaint, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They had sued, the federal government had sued ExxonMobil on behalf of their private pilots who flew the corporate executives around, because at a time when the FAA had a mandatory retirement age for pilots of, I think, 65 or 63, ExxonMobil's was 3 years earlier. They required pilots to, on safety grounds, as their executives had judged it. So the pilots had sued, and then the EEOC sued on behalf of the pilots. So then I had the names in that complaint of basically a dozen different corporate pilots who had left ExxonMobil and gotten into a fight with ExxonMobil, and their job while they were employed there was to fly the top-ranking executives of the corporation all around the world. Now, I already knew from the bin Ladens, where I had many, many private pilots as sources, that pilots, as it turns out, are fantastic gossips. And if you ever and they're also meticulous record keepers. They keep logs of every flight they take and the dates and the time it took. Now, the things that they record are not things you're interested in, wind speed or, you know, we had to reroute this way. But they keep the records. And so I'd learned that one thing, life lesson I'd learned was that if you ever get so rich that you have a private plane, treat your pilots really nicely. Be really nice to them, because if you don't, they remember it, and then when a journalist comes and says, will you talk to me, they are inclined to help. So a lot of the portraiting in the book arose from that case as well. So let me see what else I've got here. Yeah, I think you know, the various strategies of outside-in interviewing I'm not going to detain you with, because you'll get a lot of that in your classes. I think, you know, in the initial list building, you start with the obvious stuff: former directors, former retirees, people who are in fights with them, litigants that you can see already in the clips. Now I'm all over pilots, wherever they might be. But I thought I'd mention this campaign contributors, because one of the experiences of reporting on ExxonMobil was that, in comparison to all the different subjects that I had tried to report on outside in, the rate of refusal when I approached what I thought would be plausible sources with inside connections was higher than I had ever experienced. Like independent board of directors, well, they weren't independent. They all checked with public affairs. Not one of them would speak independently, even on background, about what they thought about the corporation for a while. I eventually broke that down. But you know, former employees, the kinds of people you would naturally think would be okay, maybe they'd be cautious. And I was just getting very frustrated. I thought, I'm still outside on the rock outside the main gate. And so somebody suggested that I pull a Federal Election Commission records, because in this country, if you make a campaign in any federal cycle, even in a primary, even a small donation, I think there's a minimum, maybe $50, you have to report your activity. You have to report the fact you made the contribution. And it turns out that in the FEC kind of reporting form, there is a place where you can voluntarily put your employer. You're not required, but many people do, just without thinking about it. So I pulled the FEC individual campaign contributions, all races, all parties in the federal cycles for a decade back, and then sorted by people who had voluntarily said they worked at ExxonMobil. And it produced a very interesting random sample of lots of individuals, because it's a big corporation with employees in lots of different jobs, people in accounting, people in maintenance, people at refineries, who had, for whatever reason, decided to become politically active, maybe because their brother-in-law was running for Congress in a primary, or maybe because they were active citizens. But I thought, well, these are people who have a form of citizenship that maybe will get them over the hump to talk to me. So we just did all the people search on that long list, and we cold called every one of them, and it was amazing. They were, the rate of refusal was much less problematic. It was much more normal, and the people who talked were provided almost a perfect random survey of what daily life inside the corporation was like, the safety meetings, the culture, the rules, and it provided not only some specificity, but an enormous sense of confidence about what ExxonMobil really was that I could never have acquired in the writing any other way. All right, last thing, and I'll try to wrap this up pretty quickly. So at a certain point, I went out to Africa, I went out to Indonesia, I went out into the field to report on the ground in these places where I saw points of conflict, and I ended up building a lot of the book out of those subjects. I came back from that and I thought, from Chad, from Equatorial Guinea, from Nigeria, from Indonesia, and I came back and I thought, okay, I've got that part of the book reasonably, I've got a lot of work to do, but I've got a good foundation. This thing is not going to crumble on me. But I thought, there are big, important subjects of public interest, this was the filter, that I haven't touched. How am I going to get to what a reasonable person would want me to inquire about? And so I came back that summer in September and I thought, I've got to do lobbying. I don't know what the subject is, I don't know where the stories are, but I have got to get inside their Washington office. Who are they? Where do they work? Why do they do what they do? How do they do what they do? What matters to them? And this is how I started. So some of you probably already used this. This is an NGO that has basically aggregated quite a lot of campaign and lobbying records in the United States. And so I was sitting there in a panic thinking, okay, I've got 1 year to break down their Washington office. This is going to be, my main priority now. And this was one of the first things I did, was go to Open Secrets and go to search, and then search by name. So I put in Exxon, and there it comes. So ExxonMobil would be the more common form. So I produced them. Now, the first thing that happens is that Open Secrets has aggregated their spending. So it turns out that they were quite calm for a while, and then they got very busy for a couple of years, 2008, 2009. Now, those were years that I was particularly interested in. So I said, well, I wonder what was going on. I knew about the cap and trade bill, carbon tax, essentially. I figured that probably explained at least half of that spike. But then I went like this, put 2008 on the screen, and pressed bills. So what bills did they report that they were lobbying on? Well, unfortunately, with ExxonMobil, every time you pull up an index, you get like a lot of entries. So I started going down the list, just scanning. The Domestic Prosperity and Global Freedom Act. Boy, that sounds pretty suspicious. But going down, I'll show you one that really got my attention. Yes, so then you get these Orwellian names like the Chemical Safety Improvement Act. They were very busy on that. And now I just need to find this, where is it? Well, I won't detain you. Trust me, there is a bill in here that says Children's Chemical Risk Safety Act. And I thought, okay, if ExxonMobil is lobbying on something to do with children's safety, then that's probably a good story. So it turned out that ExxonMobil is through Exxon Chemical, which is a subsidiary that has $4 billion in net profits, which is more than the net profits of, the great majority of American large publicly traded corporations, that ExxonMobil Chemical manufactures the softeners that have phthalates in them that are used in children's toys to soften them up, basically rubber ducks. And there was in Europe a concern that prolonged exposure by children to these toys could distort their physical development. The science around this is, controversial, and it also reflected the fact that in Europe, public policy was more inclined to follow the precautionary principle, that is to shut down the distribution of something that might be on the margins dangerous to children, rather than take the risks and sort it out in lawsuits later, which is sort of our strategy in this country. The idea of the precautionary principle had come around in the United States. It had been enacted into law in states, in California, Vermont, and Minnesota, which are turns out, the beachheads for European regulatory regimes. And then the Congress had gotten a hold of this, and they had introduced an act that in some iterations was called the Children's Chemical Risk Safety Act. And ExxonMobil thought that their whole chemical manufacturing business was substantially at risk because of this, and they went all in to kill the bill. And anyway, it ended up as a chapter in the book called A Person Would Have to Eat More Than 3,400 Rubber Ducks. That was my chapter title. That's what an ExxonMobil lobbyist said in opposing the bill in a meeting with a member of Congress. So the thing is that as an exercise, you could take this list of bills, or you could just do the exercise with the same resource, choose your corporation, choose your year, choose your list of bills they lobbied on, look for something that pops, that intrigues. It may not always work, but it's a pretty reliable path to journalism, because the fact is that for all of those political reporters in Washington, all those horse race campaign reporters, all of the effort that is made to cover the White House and the Congress, there are relatively few people who get up in the morning and start this way, and it's a good idea. Okay, I'm almost done. Yeah, so these other things you know about, and some other time we'll talk about them. So a word about managing the front door. So what I did with ExxonMobil as I went along was I just established a tone and a procedure of interacting with them. And I think I was 30 years into this line of work, so I had gotten a lot of my anger and frustration out. So I was in a kind of a Zen zone, so I would just call them up and say, hey, it's me again. I just wanted to check in. It's been 6 months since you returned my last call, I just want to let you know I'm still out here. I'm working. I'd welcome a chance to come down and meet you, even you PR people. If you just want to tell me, take me to lunch, be happy to tell you what I'm working on, in broad outline, trying to dangle something that they would be interested in. And, they were professional too. They were professionally following a policy of not interacting with journalists, and I was following my policy, which was to attempt to interact with them. And one thing that I had learned, which was that, especially in the bin Laden's project, the way people say no is actually reporting. If you really concentrate on it, if you press the right buttons and approaches, you can learn something even in the process of being refused. So that's why I wanted to keep this door open. And actually, in the second or third year of making those calls, as the book's endnotes reflect, I did get down to Irving, and I got like 4 or 5 background interviews with executives, sort of in or around the management committee, and They were 2-hour sessions, very closely moderated, very limited in scope, but I managed to get some questions in and to say, and also it offered me a chance to say, could we please explain to me why you behave this way, because I don't understand and I want to be empathetic. And I would get some of that kind of take. When the book was done and I was out talking about it, and there was a reporter from Reuters who had been a beat reporter on ExxonMobil in Houston for 3 years. And he was assigned to, interview me for the, and he started out by saying, I can't believe how much access you got. I said, man, I feel very sorry for you. If you think that's access, your job as a beat reporter must have been a misery. But it helped. And one of the reasons why I kept at it was not so much because I thought it would yield, anything sort of central to the narrative, although it did provide a sense of confidence and grounding that was very, very valuable. They could have done much more if I were advising them. They could have done much better with me. But in any event, they did it the way they did it. And but what I really was after was to make sure that I went through a fact-checking process with them that was grounded in consistent and honest communication, because they're a global corporation. My books go out around in different countries, and people who want to sue you and make your life miserable just for the sake of doing it will venue shop, and one of the places to venue shop is Emily's fair United Kingdom, and there the Sullivan standards of absent malice and so forth are not as reliable, though there is a new checklist of things you can do as a reporter to make a truth claim and a public interest claim. And one of the things on that checklist is, did you give the subject of your reporting a chance to comment on it? So in the case of an entire corporation and a book about an entire corporation, I wanted to make sure that I papered up basically fact-checking memos about everything in the book that could possibly be the basis for litigation. And I called them and said, I'm going to send this to you. You can comment or not comment. And eventually, they didn't even respond to that, so I just said, I'm FedExing this. I'm going to take a receipt showing that it landed at your door. Do we really have to do it this way? Can't you just acknowledge that you've received it? They finally said, yes, we acknowledge that we've received it, and that was it. As somebody said, ExxonMobil only takes information in. They don't emit any information. So they took it in, but in the end, I do think it helped kind of bulletproof the project. So I know there's a couple of people here who are working in the postgraduate fellowship program on a big investigative project we've got going about climate change, and so they're the ones who will recognize the truth of this final thought. Whoops, that was anticlimactic. The truth of this final thought. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Should I take a couple of questions or not? Yes? Okay. Yes?
Why do you think we're thinking at all that investigative stories are relevant, particularly today?
Well, because why are investigative stories relevant for today's journalists? Well, I think they've always been relevant in my mind because journalism in a democracy has a public purpose, and one of those purposes is to ask hard questions about those who exercise power in our open society, and in order to investigate some of the most powerful actors in our society, you really actually have to investigate, because while there are some forms of governmental decision-making that are relatively transparent and available, say a local sort of school board meeting in a county someplace, you can turn up at that meeting and ask your questions and feel pretty satisfied that you're watching out for what you might be interested in. Though it's always a good idea to run civil litigation records and real estate records on everybody who's on the school board. But apart from that, but something like ExxonMobil, they have very systematically, and so for that matter have corporations like Apple and others, made themselves very difficult to report on. And so how can we as journalists sort of fulfill our obligation, I think of it, but also the opportunity to ask hard questions on behalf of the public if we don't take on the very hardest subjects in this way, whether they're governmental or corporate. I think as a more practical matter, there is obviously a big question about why journalism matters in this world. The civil service profession that I grew up in has been disrupted. There's a lot of wonderful new journalism being created and imagined, some of it by graduates of this school, and many of you will be part of that. But I think it's important if you're embarking, at least this is my kind of advice, if you're embarking on a life in journalism in this time, to ask yourself, what can I do that will really matter, that will bring the world to me over the course of my career, that will allow me to do the work that I love, that will allow me to be recognized so that I can work in the way that I want to work. And the truth is that the difference between reporters that make that kind of an impact and others is often just the practice of these investigative techniques. It doesn't have to be that you are an investigative reporter all the time. It just means that you have a level of professional checklisting and daily activity and an approach to a subject that is just deeper than any other journalist around you, even if you're in a television newsroom. A lot of this work doesn't take very long. It does take knowledge. It's not like learning to be a surgeon, but it does take practice, and it does take learning. And you're here, and so you can learn all of that. But I think the answer is that over 20 or 30 years, it'll make you shine, no matter what part of journalism you go into. Yes?
Thank you for what you do, and thank you for your wonderful book on Exxon. Do you want to tell a story about how you discovered the safety environmental check for the Alaskan waters turned out to be an environmental check about, remember, I got it reversed. There was a report on seals being in warm water. Is that right?
Oh, yes. Well, I mean, one of the things I ticked through, which I could have stopped on if we had, in a longer seminar, was just kind of regulatory filings and regulatory conflicts. When you make a good list of the points of conflict that a corporation like ExxonMobil gets into, I love civil litigation, but actually there was a lot more information in state and federal regulatory filings, some of which grew up around litigation. And in the case of Alaska, I mean, I started out, you're always thinking, if you're doing a book, you have to think cinematically, so where does this thing open? And I'm a big fan of the Poseidon Adventure open. Like, I want a big, dramatic disaster to start the book if I can find one. And so in this case, the Valdez wreck seemed like a place to start. It turned out that it was a transformational event in the life of the corporation, so it was also a valid place to start. And so I ended up going and just kind of sorting through all of those records and going out and spending time in Alaska. And it was from there that came, from the regulatory records. Yes?
Your quote says, "A good investigation is never over. It's temporarily abandoned." So is there a secret to your book?
We're working on it here at the school. No, no. There is a way that I guess if you choose this work for a long time, you do end up in certain kind of channels that you move away from and come back to. I can't really explain my portfolio because it's a little eclectic, but I did a book about oil when I was 27. And so I've always been interested in it, and in this case, I've got a bunch of FOIA requests in the government that sources have told me have yielded these massive, sort of throat-choking piles of responsive material, particularly about the Iraq War, that my sources say when you get these, you're going to have another book, but they've gotten tied up in the system. I can't seem to dislodge them. And at this point, I've got so many other things going on. I just figure at some point, someone will back a truck up to my address and unload all of these FOIA documents about 9 years after I asked for them, and then I'll say, oh, well, there's a project. I had FOIA requests returned. When I first went out to South Asia, I filed a bunch of FOIA requests about Benazir Bhutto and her family and various other things. And I got responses like 16 years later. And they do keep going on and on. Let me take the student behind you and then come forward.
How did ExxonMobil react to your book getting out, and what impact has the book made?
I wouldn't ExxonMobil reacted the way they always react, with studious silence, which to me was better than being like bundled into a white van on the street, or more likely, sued until I had run out of, deductibles. And so I think they initially had a plan to combat the book as if it were hostile, fundamentally hostile to their interests, and then at a certain point they read it, and they thought, well, actually there's a lot of detail in here. It's not a book we wanted written. It's not a book that we like, but there's no reason to go to war against it, I guess is, yeah, that's my assumption. Yes?
Strategically, when you start talking about approaching the front door, I wondered about the timing issue. You seem to suggest that it's like the first thing to do. And I know that sometimes there's consideration given to you start by going and asking them, or tipping them off in some way, in which they're going to shut down all of my sources.
Yeah, there's no right answer. I mean, in my experience, there's no right answer to that, but you're asking all the right questions. I don't have a kind of a philosophy about it. I want to do what's best for the project, what's best for the work. I think one thing I've learned, though, is that, or one lesson I've taken away from my own experiences is that you pay a price if you wait too long to get started with the hard stuff. In the case of the front door here, knocking on it didn't yield anything other than Zen challenging frustration for about 2.5 years, really, and then it did. And I realized in retrospect that, in my theory of the case, they'll wait till the end, but they'll also watch, what is your tone, how are you proceeding. I knew that I was being monitored by them all of the time. Once in Washington, I had a very hard time getting people to talk to me, and once in Washington, I did get someone after a lot of persuasion to sit down with me, and a lot of conversation about ground rules and so on. And we sat down. I said, I'm really glad finally to have a chance to be with you and talk a little. And he said, well, don't be naive. ExxonMobil knows you're here right now. And I thought, wow. So two things are true. Either he's right, or he thinks that and he's not right. And either way, that is a powerful effect. I mean, one of the practical problems I ran into with ExxonMobil, and I think it's pretty common in some corporations, ExxonMobil has more leverage than most. They have a very sweet benefits package for their lifelong employees. And they have a defined benefit pension, for example, that you earn credits against. And it's pretty much one of the last companies that is a lifetime employer. If you're willing to adapt to their rather suffocating culture and their rules, and you're willing to move around a lot, you can do quite well and quite comfortably. But they have everyone sign non-disclosure agreements that puts your entire pension package at risk if you have unauthorized contact with a reporter. I saw those packages and the passages, and that means you got to be pretty brave, or you have to be pretty careful, or you don't need the pension, I suppose. Okay, a couple more, and then we'll finish. Yes.
As you talked, I kept thinking you might well retire and open a detective agency. But more seriously, the federal government has as much interest in discretion and secrecy as ExxonMobil, and yet we have Daniel Ellsberg, and we now have Mr. Snowden. Does the federal government need to learn a few lessons from Exxon?
Well, I think my experience of the government, and probably yours as a consumer of government services, is that there's something about the character of government that undermines the kind of pursuit of ironclad discipline. It's there in some of the secret organizations, for sure. In the military, it's better, but we live in an open society, and if you tell a lot of Americans over and over again, you're not allowed to share something that you think is in the public interest with the public, we still are in a time where over the course of years, somebody is going to say to themselves, no, this is not right. I'm going to take that step. I'm going to take that risk. And journalism is one of the ways that happens. We are now in an era characterized by Edward Snowden's decision-making and actions that puts the whistleblower in a slightly more authorial position because of the way technology has changed. But yeah, I think it's really about the context, not about the management techniques. Okay, I haven't been on this side of the room, and I'll take those three, and then anyone who I haven't been able to address, come see me and I'll answer your question before I leave. Yes?
You wrote an article for the New Yorker about ISIS and oil, is real?
Yeah.
And I wonder how successful you have been in finding actual documentation of oil company or other company communications with the, generals or the State Department saying, in our interest, we wish for you to take over the following area, for example, or to see to it that this group or that group doesn't seize this area.
Yeah.
I think there are things that can be inferred from contacts, but I don't know if you've actually been able to get documentation. WikiLeaks did a little of that, but it's
Yeah.
very...
Yeah, there are bits and pieces that have come out about ExxonMobil and other companies in the Kurdish regional government's area, and there's some that's come out of Baghdad. I got some FOIA material. This big, sort of throat-choking FOIA request that's supposedly in the government that has some of this in it, I think. But I don't, the one thing to bear in mind about ExxonMobil's relationship with the U.S. government is that it's mutually hostile. This is not, they see themselves as an independent sovereign. They believe that the people at the State Department regard them as, at best benign and at worst evil. And so they keep their distance. They don't think the U.S. government can help them very much. They think they're more effective on their own in Russia or in Africa than with State Department assistance. Just to give you a sense of why, in Chad, which is one of the world's poorest countries, really benighted, way down there on the bottom of the Human Development Index, there was an episode where the Chadian government tried to throw ExxonMobil out of the country briefly, or threatened to, and the State Department and the World Bank, the Bush administration all scrambled to try to manage the situation. Complicated story, it's in the book, I won't bore you with it, but at a certain point, the president of Chad had to decide whose entreaties he was going to listen to, ExxonMobil or the U.S. ambassador across N'Djamena, who was saying something different from ExxonMobil. Well, at that moment, all U.S. aid, U.S. government aid to Chad, humanitarian, refugee, counterterrorism even the stuff in the black boxes, that was probably about $10 million. The royalty that ExxonMobil delivered to the Chadian government each year was at that time about $650 million. So if you're thinking, okay, now who do I want to do business with about my own public policies, that is completely out of scale. That's not typical, but it does show what the power of oil companies in some poor countries can be. It's a very simple equation. Okay, I'm going to take one more question, and then I'll take the rest offline. Yes?
When you filed your FOIA requests, how specific were you in your request? Just say any email containing the word Exxon or specific, a bit more specific than that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I worked on that. I got a lawyer. It wasn't very expensive, a lawyer who was kind of schooled in this to work on the language. What I was advised, and what worked pretty well, because I did have good results with the FOIA requests on ExxonMobil in Aceh, in Equatorial Guinea, in Nigeria, especially in Chad. What I was really advised was to narrow the date ranges and to narrow the scope of documents that I was interested in. So it was very much a message in a bottle. So I tried to concentrate on, from what I knew in my experience would surface good narrative material. So I would ask for date ranges around violence, date ranges around big events, not like the last 5 years. I would say, go look at these 5 weeks and give me everything between the embassy and the Africa desk and back and forth that involved, and then I would use ExxonMobil, oil. Was not just that mentioned ExxonMobil. There are certain privacy provisions that if you've got a hostile FOIA officer, they'll opt out to protect, sort of corporate information. So you kind of need to surround the name of the corporation with some other subjects. But in the end, I thought that I was well served because it was all about timeliness. I just needed this stuff in time to be able to use it. That the best thing that I was advised was to really narrow the date ranges and to associate the date ranges with events that I could reasonably guess would produce good material. And that there's not always an analog to that, but that's the way it worked in this project. You've been very patient. It's 7:15. Thank you very much. Yes.